The paper came to her on a wet evening at the end of October, in the mess room of a salmon cannery on the Astoria waterfront, folded twice, and gone soft at the creases from 2 days in a man's coat pocket. Merritt Oland was 38 years old that autumn, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with sun-freckled skin and ash-blonde hair going silver at the temples. She had fed cannery crews for 9 seasons, and in all that time nobody had ever asked for her by name. Cooks were sent for. Nobody asked. The man who brought the paper was a rock train brakeman named Oscar Tulo, 19 years old, with sand in every seam of his coat and his cap held flat against his chest in both hands. He laid the paper on the scrubbed table and smoothed it flat with the side of his fist, and she dried her hands on her apron and turned it around. It was one sheet, ruled in blue, covered from the top line to the bottom with names, some in a clear clerk's hand, some in capitals climbing uphill, some across with a name written beside it. She counted them twice, because she did not believe the first count. There were 46. Above the names somebody had written that the undersigned, being the men of the Jetty Works at Gale Spit, respectfully asked the contractors to engage Mrs. Oland of Astoria as cook for the winter, and would take it as a favor done to them personally. Then she asked the boy why. He said that in September a gang of them had eaten in her cannery mess, and a big man named Bern Cathcart had put down a plate of her boiled beef and her hot bread and said out loud, in front of everybody, that a man who could eat like that every night of the winter could stand any amount of ocean. When word came that the contractors meant to put up a cookhouse at the spit camp, the crew had made the paper in the lee of the rock pile with a borrowed pen, and Cathcart had carried it into the office himself. Merritt Oland folded the sheet back along its creases and held it in her lap, under the table, where the boy could not see her hands. She said yes before she had properly finished thinking, and she was honest enough with herself afterward to admit she had not said yes to the wages. She had said yes to the paper. She went down to Gale Spit on the 2nd of November on the contractor's beach wagon, with a carpet bag and a wooden box of her own knives roped shut. The wagon came out of the dunes an hour before noon, and she stood up on the footboard to see the works. Out of the last of the beach grass a timber trestle ran west, 2 miles of it, straight off the land and into the Pacific Ocean, the piles standing in white water to their caps. Halfway along it a locomotive was working, and behind the locomotive 9 flat cars of black basalt, every block the size of a parlor stove, and along the tops of the cars men were walking with iron bars in their hands, levering the rock off the side into the surf. While she watched, a sea came up through the timbers in a white sheet higher than the locomotive and fell on them, and when it cleared they were still walking the load with their bars. The noise of it never once stopped the whole time she lived there. The camp lay behind the second line of dunes, 2 long bunkhouses, a blacksmith shop, a stable for the mules, the timekeeper's office with its 1 window, and the cookhouse. The cookhouse was new. 70 feet long, board and batten, the whitewash still wet on the doorframe and streaked where the blowing sand had stuck to it. Inside, there was a black range with 6 lids and the shipping straw still in the firebox, a scrubbed table running the whole length of the room, benches down both sides, a shelf of new tin plates that had never had food on them, and hanging lamps with the wicks still white. She got the fire going that afternoon and burned the raw pine smell out of the ovens, then scrubbed a floor that did not need scrubbing, because she wanted her hands busy. There was a notice nailed to the outside of that door, on the seaward side, and the blown sand had packed into the paper until it was near the color of the boards. She saw it. She meant to read it. There was a barrel of flour to get in out of the weather, And she did not read it that day, and she did not read it the next day, and by the third day it had stopped being a thing she saw at all. She laid her first supper on the evening of the 3rd of November. A standing rib of beef out of the contractor's stores, roasted under a crust of cracked pepper and coarse salt. Potatoes browned off in the beef fat. 4 dozen loaves out of her own ovens, split and stacked under 2 clean cloths, a wash boiler of coffee, and dried apples stewed soft with cinnamon. Because men who spend the day in cold water want something sweet at the end of a plate. She set 46 tin plates down that table and laid the knives and forks square to them, and lit both lamps, though it was not full dark, because a lit room looks like a welcome from outside. The 6 o'clock whistle went at the trestle. She heard the men come up over the dunes the way you hear a field of geese, all their voices together and none of them separate, and she put her hands under her apron and stood where she could be seen from the door. They came up the path and they went by. They went by the windows in the dark, the whole crowd of them. 46 men in wet canvas and rubber boots with their coats up over their heads against the flying sand, and the lamplight went across their faces one after another as they passed, and not one of them turned his head, and not one of them came in. Then she went down off the step and followed them, and found them in the lee of the big dune behind the bunkhouses, sitting on their heels in the wind. There was no fire. They were eating out of their own hands, cold bread, hard cheese cut off with a clasp knife, a tin of sardines going along from man to man. Not a one of them would look at her, and not a one of them would eat what was on that table. She went back up and blew the lamps out one at a time. She did it again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that, and the night after that. 5 nights. 5 suppers laid the whole length of that table and refused, and not one fork lifted off it. By the 3rd morning she was carrying the untouched food out to the tide line in a wash basket, and the gulls knew her before she was out of the door. On the 5th night she did not go back inside. She walked down into the lee of the dune with the wind taking her apron out sideways, and stood in front of the whole crowd of them, where the light from the bunkhouse window would fall on her face, and said she would be obliged if somebody would tell her what she had done. For a moment nobody moved. Then a big man got up off a length of driftwood at the front. Byrne Cathcart, 51 years old, a head taller than the men around him, with a gray-shot dark beard and hands cracked open across the knuckles from wet rope and cold rock. He did not spare her. He told her there was nothing whatever wrong with her cooking, that there was not a man on that sand who did not remember the plate he had eaten in Astoria in September, and that if she thought this was about her beef she could stop thinking it right now. Then he told her the paper with their names on it had gone into the contractor's office by his own hand, in good faith, and that the contractors had read it and thanked him for it and kept it. And then he said the thing she carried with her the rest of her life. He said a man's wants are the easiest thing in the world to use against him. He said they had told the company exactly what they wanted, and the company had taken it and hung it up on a hook. He said, "You are on the hook, Mrs. You are the sweetest bit of bait that was ever set in front of this crew, and there is not one of us going to be the fish." Not one man in that whole crowd stood up out of the sand and said Cathcart was wrong. She went back up the path with the wind behind her, and the 2 words going around and around in her head, and stood a long time on the step of a lit cookhouse nobody would eat in. Then she took a lamp down off its hook and carried it around to the seaward side of the door, and got down on her knees in the sand and read the notice. It was printed, not written, which meant it had been printed in quantity, and was not about Gale Spit alone. It said that on and from the first day of October, board would be provided to all men employed upon the works at the company cookhouse, at 40 cents a day, the same to be stopped out of wages at every pay, whether taken or not taken. And then it said the second thing, in smaller print at the foot of the sheet, in the way that the sentence that matters is always the small one. Any man entered on the books as having taken board would be held to have accepted board, and would not thereafter be permitted to provide for himself upon the works. She read it 4 times with the lamp held inside her shawl to keep the wind off the flame. The first day of October. She had come down on the 2nd of November. There had been no roof on that cookhouse on the 1st of October, no range in it and no cook anywhere on that sand, and every man had been stopped 40 cents a day for a supper that did not exist, the whole month through, while he bought his own bread besides. $12.40 a man, out of wages of $1.75 on a day the sea let them work, and nothing at all on a day it did not. The first mouthful was the signature. The day one man out of those 46 sat down at her table and ate a plate of her beef, that man went on the books as having taken board, and every man after him would be told the board was taken and wanted, and it would go on being stopped all winter, out of the pockets of men who could mess themselves for less than half of it. Empty plates were the whole of their argument. They could not strike in November with their families up the river in Astoria, and they could not go to law with no money to go with. All they could do was be seen, every single night walking past a lit door. She was not angry at them any more. She was standing behind the wrong side of a table, and every hour she kept it laid, she was the argument the company meant to use on them. The timekeeper at Gale Spit was a small, mild, exceedingly neat man named Purdy, who kept his pens standing in a china cup and had never once been anything but courteous to her. On Saturday she went to his window for her first pay, and there was no money in the envelope. Purdy was genuinely sorry, and she could tell the difference, having met a good many men who were not. He turned the ledger around on the counter and ran the nib of his pen down the column without touching the paper, the way a careful man does. Her engagement was wages and board found, and against that phrase, in a ruled column at the right-hand side of the page, was an entry for every night she had worked. Stores drawn against the cookhouse and not consumed. The beef, the flour, the coffee, the dried apples priced out to the half-cent 5 nights of them. A cook was answerable for stores drawn and not eaten. $2.40 standing against her and no wages at all. She looked at the 2 columns on the one page, and then she saw the whole shape of it at once. The way you see a face in a curtain and afterward cannot unsee it. 46 men were being charged 40 cents a day for a supper, and she was being charged for that very same supper over again on that very same night because nobody had eaten it. 1 supper. Sold twice. Both halves in the same careful hand, ruled and dated and totaled on the one page, by a mild little man who had never once stopped to think what he was adding up. She asked Mr. Purdy for the book. He could not. She asked for a copy of the page. He was not permitted. So she asked him for the one thing a clerk cannot refuse a body, her own account made out in full and signed, because a person is entitled to know what a company says a person owes. Then he took a clean sheet and copied out her account, every entry, the stores and the prices and the nights, and at the head of it he wrote what the stores had been drawn for, because he was an accurate man, and it would have pained him to leave it off. Supper, 46 men. And he signed it, and blotted it, and passed it under the glass to her. On Monday the contractors shut the cookhouse. In the letter that came down from Astoria, the men were not mentioned at all. It was the waste. 5 nights of stores drawn and thrown out to the gulls, the cook discharged as of that morning. The range to be crated and shipped back up the river. Miss, Purdy told her, unhappily, that the $2.40 would stand against her name and be sent after her, and asked whether she had anywhere to go. She said she had a sister-in-law at Marlin Landing, 12 miles north up the beach, with a room over a net loft that had stood empty since June. Then she picked up her carpet bag in one hand and her box of knives in the other, and instead of turning north she went west, out along the trestle, into the wind, in a black wool shawl, past the rock train and the men on top of the load, who stood up straight to watch her go by. At the end of the finished timber, in a shanty office built out on piles above the water, sat the resident engineer for the government, a gray old army man named Major Kittredge, who signed the contractor's estimates every month and paid them out of the appropriation. She had no appointment and no lawyer, and she was a discharged cook with sand to her knees. She put one sheet of paper down on his desk, her own account, signed by the timekeeper, with the heading written across the top of it in the timekeeper's own hand. Supper, 46 men. She had thought out a speech on that trestle and threw every word of it away at the door. She said, read the top line, then read the column, and then ask yourself who paid for that beef. Major Kittredge read it. Then he read it again. Then he took off his spectacles and asked her, very carefully, whether the men had been stopped board for the month of October. She said every man on the works, from the 1st of October at 40 cents a day, for a cookhouse with no roof on it until the last week of the month. He sent a boy running for Purdy's book before she was down off his step. What came of it took 9 days, and she was there for none of it. The specifications the contractors worked under said labor upon the works was to be paid in money, not in board, not in orders on a store. A board deduction posted a month before there was a roof on the building was not board at all. The notice came off the door. The stoppages for October were paid back to every man on the roll, and the winter's board was struck out entirely. Merritt Holland got none of it. The $2.40 was canceled, and that was the whole of what she received, though she did remark to her sister-in-law that it was a strange thing to be owed nothing at all by everybody. She was living over the net loft at Marlin Landing by then, mending nets at 8 cents a fathom. On the last Saturday in November, she heard boots on the outside stair. There were 2 of them, Oscar Tullo, with his cap in both hands as usual, and behind him, filling the whole of the stairhead, Bern Cathcart, who had walked 12 miles up the beach with his boots hung round his neck and had sat down and put them back on at the bottom of the stair, so as not to come to a woman's door barefoot. He set a sailcloth bag down on the top step, and it made the sound that money makes. Every man on the works had put in $50 out of what had come back to him. $23 in quarters and halves and 1 gold piece, tied at the neck with a bit of marline, and lying on top of the bag was a sheet of paper, ruled in blue, covered from the top line to the bottom with names, 46 of them, and 1 line written above. The undersigned ask Mrs. Oland of Marlin Landing to cook them 1 supper, and will pay for it beforehand. Cathcart never did say the word sorry. What he said was that they had been right about the hook and wrong about her, and that a man who cannot tell those 2 apart has no business opening his mouth in front of a crowd. She took the money. Refusing it would have turned it into a gift, and it was not a gift. It was a wage, and it was the first honest money that camp ever produced. She asked them what they wanted cooked. Cathcart said the crew had argued about it 2 days and settled in the end on the one thing there was no argument about anywhere: planked salmon, split and nailed to a cedar board and stood up around an open fire on the hard sand, the way it is done at the landings, because a man on the jetty works can get a fish, or a fire, or a Sunday, and in 5 months not one of them had managed all three at once. The work shut down for the winter on the second Saturday in December, when the bar went unworkable and the rock trains were run back into the dunes and chained. Merritt Oland spent the $23 in 2 days and did not keep back a cent of it. 12 big late-run Chinook off a gill netter at the landing, the smallest of them longer than her arm, potatoes and butter and flour for biscuits, and 2 pecks of cranberries off the bog behind the landing. She was out on the hard sand at first light with 2 boys from the landing and a wheelbarrow. She split the 12 fish down the back and laid them out flat and open, nailed every one skin down on a cedar plank with the sap still bright in the wood, and salted them and laid on butter and cracked pepper. Then she stood the planks on edge in a wide ring leaning inward toward a driftwood fire built long instead of high, so the heat came at the fish sideways all afternoon. There is nothing else in American cooking that smells the way that smells. The fat stands up out of the flesh and beads and runs, the scorching cedar gives its sweetness back into the fish, and the flesh goes from wet red to deep coral and opens along the flakes and crisps gold at the edges. The tide was dead low a little after 3, and it had to be, because the hard sand under Galehead is only walkable at low water and there is no other road along that coast. They came around the head in one long body, out on the wet shining sand, with the sea on their left hand and the cliff on their right. 46 men in their shore clothes with their boots hung round their necks and their trousers rolled to the knee, walking 12 miles of beach to eat one supper. Oscar Tullo was out in front, because he was 19. Bern Cathcart was at the back, because he had told 2 men with bad feet that nobody was getting left behind on that sand. They smelled it before they saw it. She watched the whole line come up out of a walk into something faster the moment the wind turned. Then they came over the last bar and saw the ring of fire and the 12 planks standing up in it, coral and gold and running fat, with the steam going off them straight up into a low December sun. Cathcart got there first of the older men, and his hat came off his head and never did get picked up again, and he stood with one arm out at full stretch toward the nearest plank and his mouth wide open, shouting something into the wind that nobody afterward could agree on the words of. They ate on driftwood and on their heels and standing up, salmon off the plank with their fingers and off tin plates with forks, hot biscuits split and buttered, cranberries stewed dark red with sugar, coffee out of a wash boiler. Oscar Tullo got up on a stump of driftwood with a biscuit in his right hand and said he had signed his name to a piece of paper twice in his life, and both times it had been worth the trouble. And 46 men made a noise on that beach that carried the whole way to the landing. Merritt Oland cooked at that fire until dark, and ate standing up like everybody else. She kept both sheets of paper folded together in the tray of her trunk for the rest of her life, and when anybody asked about the winter at Gale Spit, she never talked about the fire or the fish. She would lay the 2 sheets side by side on the table and put one finger on the second one, and say the first was only a request, and that any fool alive can be wanted. The second one was a wage.